title of my talk is Storying Tacoma. You know, if we were to create a video for Tacoma along the lines of the Portlandia clip that we just saw, not only what would the stories comprising the narrative be, but also more fundamentally, who gets to be a protagonist in this story. I do also want to say just how wonderful it is to see everybody here. I was looking for Sarah Clara, Laura Herman moments ago and remembering 5 years ago passing out flyers and trying to get the money for lunch at the last minute, and it's just a delight to see so many people gathered here today to be able to talk about things that are important to our city and to our region. Also amazing to be able to be sharing the stage with Jim Throgmorton. The history of narrative in planning studies and planning theory is one where Jim looms large. In addition to people like Seymour Mandelbaum and Leonie Sandercock, it's really been Jim's work that's been very influential on my own. His books and his article, Planning as Persuasive Storytelling and Story and Sustainability, have really influenced the planning field tremendously, and in particular have been the basis for some of my work that I'll talk really briefly about before I get on to talking about a new piece, this third piece on Tacoma. And then finishing up by posing some questions for you all and for all of us collectively on this issue of whose voices, not only whose voices are being heard, but also whose voices are not being heard, and how does that matter for branding the city or thinking about the city of Tacoma. So one piece that definitely builds off of Throgmorton's work in thinking about narrative and story and its role in land use outcomes and in city development. This is an image of the LA River and a site called Taylor Yard that historically, if you know anything about Los Angeles or the LA River, essentially encased in concrete starting in the early 20th century. And the movement that has very slowly emerged over decades and kind of bit by bit worked to try to bring the site and the place back to a more livable, enjoyable kind of park future, something that would look more like this is a site plan for the same place. We analyze and maybe very much like what Ken Greenberg was mentioning, the idea of a tipping point, analyze a period of time throughout the 1990s where there were entities and their storylines, their discourses, we call them, kind of keeping the site in a more industrial and flood control past, and then slowly a tipping point that emerged with a new meta-narrative around the potential for a park and how that really enabled the transformation of the site. And in fact, a new state park opened at Taylor Yard in 2007. Another more recent piece that also picks up on some of the language that Jim was mentioning, the idea of emplotment and kind of who gets to participate in a narrative. A piece that was recently published last year in Urban Studies, thinking about, actually the issue was governing for resilience. And our intervention here in thinking about narrative is to try to suggest that the use of the term resilience and thinking about the idea of resilience has really been colonized somewhat, in our view, by very scientific, kind of hyper-rational definitions, when resilience really came from the psychology literature and notions of interpreting your place and your role in adapting towards a new future. And so we're trying to point out the role of narrative and helping people to move forward together in cities, and to unseat or unsettle foundational narratives that are not helping cities be resilient. And so in this case, this is another image of the Los Angeles River. Suggesting that the idea of thinking of the river and its redevelopment as everybody's front yard and different versions of different front yards that it could be for different groups within the city really enables what we're calling plurivocity. Lots of voices, lots of different entities and individuals being able to implot themselves into this emerging set of changes that's happening in their city. Piece that will perhaps, I hope, be more interesting to the audience assembled here, and maybe the first time today that we're going to talk in some depth about Tacoma, which is really an extraordinary city with a great history, and as you can see from this image, it's maybe not so evident today with the weather that we're having, gorgeous physical location. right? We are here nestled in the Puyallup River Valley beneath Mount Rainier, Mount Tacoma. The hills, the views that we enjoy here, just an extraordinarily beautiful city. And I think sometimes it does take coming in from outside to really have that experience. I still gasp sometimes when I'm driving up a hill or coming down towards the port, towards different areas of the city. So the next paper where I'm really looking at narrative and thinking about narrative will be familiar to many of you, I think. And I see Steve Atkinson nestled in the back of the room. This is Steve's life for years and knows an awful lot more about it than I do. In the day-to-day working through of the creation of a shoreline master program for the city of Tacoma. One of many things that Tacoma has pioneered on, Tacoma was one of the first of over 240 cities in the state of Washington required to update the shoreline master program, supposedly by next year. We'll see whether that happens or not. The process of updating in Tacoma, from a technical planning perspective, dividing the shoreline into 6 different kinds of designations, 16 discrete physical geographic zones, designating with different shoreline zones, a really extraordinarily long, sensitive, arduous process that Steve undertook and oversaw. The thing that I focus on in this paper will perhaps also not be surprising to those of you who have followed this process. This is an image of a site in North Tacoma called the Sperry Dock parcel. How many people were aware of this controversy over the last several years? Right. So in almost 50 miles of shoreline in the city of Tacoma, the amount of public comment, the letters that were written, the thing people wrote to the newspaper about, that they came out to public meetings and were arguing about and upset about, was this site, less than a mile of the entire shoreline. And the questions that pertain to this site as far as how it was going to be zoned and what that meant for how Tacoma understands itself and how we view our future and our identity and how we intend to use this precious shoreline research. So as I said, the question of how it should be zoned, here's a map showing the location of the site. You can see we are here in downtown Tacoma. Here's the Sperry Ocean Dock parcel, Point Defiance, which is significant to the set of questions that or analysis I'm about to show you. On the one hand is the argument that it should absolutely be zoned in what's called the high intensity designation, that it's part of the industrial waterfront. It's absolutely consistent with the historical port identity of this city, that it's adjacent to rail infrastructure, to a highway spur, and at least as significantly to natural deep water moorage, which you may or may not know is quite rare to have that kind of deep shelf. So lots of folks coming out in support of this particular designation. And on the other hand, the equally strong advocacy for the S6 Urban Conservancy designation. Now this line of thinking, or this narrative, as I'll describe it in more detail momentarily, says that this is really part of the Ruston Way waterfront, which has already been redeveloped into a green space and a pedestrian trail, that it is immediately adjacent to North End residential neighborhoods, which everybody in the room knows, maybe many of our guests don't know, some of the loveliest, most livable neighborhoods and most historical neighborhoods in the city. So adjacent to Old Town and the Tacoma Salt Marsh, which is a restored salmon habitat. And so for these reasons, it really is argued that it needed to be integrated and kind of reassembled into this urban conservancy zone. But as I said, and as Steve can certainly attest, not an easy decision, and it has persisted on the arguments and the contesting narratives around this decision over a course of years. On the one hand, the working waterfront narrative for the high intensity designation, and on the other hand, what I'm calling the dome to defiance narrative, arguing for the urban conservancy and the shoreline trail. Both narratives, I'm going to go through the storylines and the different protagonists that I offer in this analysis. And I don't want to dwell here too long. I think, as I said, it'll be recognizable to many Tacoma residents. And I would be interested in feedback either during our Q&A or later if anybody's interested in the paper itself. I'd love to share the paper. I'm always wanting to try to make sure that my data is accurate in the analysis that I'm trying to generate. We have business and industrial leadership in this city very firmly coming out in support of the working water narrative. The Port of Tacoma, the Chamber of Commerce, keep Tacoma open for business. That's how I'm characterizing that particular storyline. The waterfront workers, people who earn a living wage on the waterfront, and with that wage are able to buy a house and support their families, and has been one of the kind of backbone characteristics of Tacoma for years, that we need to protect family wage jobs and protect the land use zones that enable the high intensity uses that have supported the city historically. Military and citizens, that it's essential for regional and national security to have the ready reserve in the merchant marine ships that were moored at that particular site. So these different storylines coming together in a larger narrative arc, really trying to claim that space. And on the other side, you have North End residents who are not pleased about these ships in their backyard. And I know that there's some in the room right now. They are loud, they're noisy, they spew soot. The idea is that, this is not the port. We need to enjoy our bay, or, less probably positive characterization is not in my backyard. Get it out of my residential area. Extending that argument for shoreline access, saying, this is really for the entire region. It needs to be zoned urban conservancy. There's an environmental equity concern here, and we ought to be providing access to the bay for everybody. Tourist and civic leaders who say we need to develop this trail. It's part of our economic development strategy. We've got hotels, we've got museums, we're trying to get people to come and stay here. We need this 7 continual miles of shoreline trail. And environmentalists who say we have to restore shoreline ecological function, and that we have gone and this is the very reason for the update of the SMP to begin with, we've gone too long without adequately protecting our shoreline. So quickly, I really also want to get to the larger point here about voices that aren't being heard, but referring back to Jim Throgmorton's point about the elements of story and the elements of narrative and why they're effective and powerful, what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that the Dome to Defiance narrative is particularly powerful because it consists of this metaphor of the missing link, whereas the working waterfront narrative is trying to argue for a kind of domino effect. There's a kind of persistent set of claims put forth by members of that coalition, and it's hard to really accept the domino effect position if you look across the bay and you see the looming cranes and this enormous port complex. However, the missing link metaphor kind of makes sense from an experiential perspective. You're walking on Ruston Way, or you're trying to get down to the Thea Foss, so missing link is really quite resonant. In addition to the metaphor, the idea of the engagement with the past and also the claims that the narrative is making on the future. That rather than trying necessarily to always harken back to the past, the Dome to Defiance narrative says this is who we could be, this is what's possible in the future, which for various reasons that we could talk about seems to have a good deal of appeal for folks, and engaging with a future vision and ideas of growth. And finally, I would say that one of the reasons that this narrative was ultimately successful, because it was successful, the zone right now stands as a transition zone. It's not the pure urban conservancy, but S6, S7 moving into urban conservancy, is that the state policy was more fully engaged by the Dome to Defiance narrative. That in addition to the environmental quality piece of the state, there are three aspects of the state policy. And the working waterfront narrative only really fully engaged one, which was the water-dependent uses, whereas the Dome to Defiance narrative engaged two. what those narratives help us to realize, I think, in Tacoma, and I would even go so far as to say one of the reasons perhaps that we're here today and there is such interest and hopefully potential for Tacoma to be having a bigger conversation about what exactly our brand is, what is our vision and our identity, is that I think there was a pretty thoroughgoing recognition, and in fact I heard frequently at meetings and in comments, this is not a set of questions that we should be working out on a 1-mile zone designation for a regulatory plan update. That in fact there's so much hunger and desire to have these larger conversations about who we are as a city and what's intended for our shoreline. And so I think in recognizing that there is a need for a brand and a narrative, it is very much responding to the fact that using a shoreline plan update to try to work out, to try to shoehorn these conversations about what the heck is going on in this city is actually part and parcel of a larger tradition in American planning, which by and large is quite reactive. It wasn't until public health concerns were quite dangerous and pressing in New York City, one of our first large cities in the 19th century, that we saw the first housing reform in the country. Again, public health that we saw, in addition to that regulatory intervention, the first really large-scale capital planning and infrastructure investments in a sewer system and water carriage. Again, trying to kind of react to an already present reality that had become such a big problem that the city said, okay, we got to do something. And the first municipal zoning code in New York City, which is on an island, and so the recognition that we've got nowhere to go, we have to start to try to rationalize land uses. I do want to take a moment here, and I'm going to go over, but I feel like it's really important to be able to say Tacoma stands apart from this reactive tradition in American planning, and I think it's essential that we recognize this. And on this vein of like, what do we do in Tacoma that's good? Maybe it takes an outsider to tell people, like, there's a lot that Tacoma does that's really quite outstanding. We were two of the very first Superfund sites in the country with the Asarco and the Commencement Bay site, pioneering what's known as the Tacoma process on the Asarco site, nationwide model. The Thea Foss remediation, trying to sort out potentially responsible parties, moving with private and the city leadership and private actors coming together to go through an arbitration process and enable the development of the Foss. The very site that you're sitting on, the presence of UW Tacoma, the leadership and the agility that took to bring a new campus of the University of Washington to this city. The Dome and Brewery Area Sub-Area Plan and EIS. This is the Growing Transit Communities project that was mentioned earlier, partnership with HUD, with the PSRC, working proactively with the Department of Ecology and EPA. Kristen Lynette is sitting back in the room someplace, has successfully gained the very first designation in the country as a STAR certified community for ICLEI, which is an international organization for sustainability assessment. 2 minutes, okay. So all of these wonderful proactive things that we've done in Tacoma, I think the recognition is now there as well. Yeah, we do need a better brand. We need a better identity. Especially as we recognize that in the 21st century, being able to have a brand and be recognizable is in some senses how things get done and immensely powerful. So what I'd like to focus on now in my remaining minute and a half is who gets to be a protagonist. And I am going to very deliberately do my best effort at a David Bowe impression. David Bowe must have been thrilled when we were talking about Ken Greenberg brought up Calvino. I think the very first person that I heard of Calvino from was David Bowe. But you may know that Bowe is quite brilliant at posing questions and trying to be this agent provocateur, and so I'm going to try to take on that role. My research is on waterway redevelopment, and despite the fact that I can tell you from 10 years of studying waterways just how extraordinary it is that the Foss Waterway has been developed and is in the state that it is right now, and all of the innovations and partnerships that clearly went into that, I'm now going to pose a few questions about what's missing. And people who should be perhaps part of our narrative and part of the story. The first is, this is an image of the Xenolinic project at McCarver School. Linda Isham has been a stalwart leader on this campus in building a partnership between UW-Tacoma and the McCarver students. These students designed this park, and it is an extraordinary space. And why am I mentioning that? What would it be if kids and children were part of designing and imagining what this city should be? If you look at the Thea Foss, it's not a very child-friendly environment. It's empty a lot of the time. What if children had been engaged, or this was a spot that was family-friendly where you and I and all of us together would want to take our kids? Number two, on the Foss Waterway, when we think about groups or stories that are not being told and the implications for kind of who's framing the narrative, this is an image from Seattle. It's a totem pole adjacent to the Center for Wooden Boats. I was fortunate enough recently to hear John Paul Jones, an architect in Seattle who's also a Native American, talking about the difficulty of siting a totem pole in South Lake Union, the years and the effort that it took to finally get this totem pole sited, and how much he really would like to see a wooden canoe carving facility and a boating facility, and it just, running up against all this political opposition. So the next question I have for all of us collectively is, what would it mean to be a city where tribal members are esteemed and visible? I was fortunate enough a couple weeks ago to go to a powwow where one of my students was a lead dancer in Seattle, and watched her in this amazing glass and steel building where you could see Lake Washington on the other side, and realizing, I have students in my classes who are Muckleshoot, who are Puyallup, who are Nisqually, who are Chickasaw, who are Blackfeet, who are Sioux, who are Cherokee. The historian Carl Thrush, who is at the University of British Columbia, talks about the fallacy that urban history requires tribal history to end before there can be an urban. And when we, on the one hand, with land development, of course, there were land settlement claims that needed to be developed on the tidelands in order to develop that land and to bring private interests in. But it also reinforces the notion that we don't have a robust and vibrant tribal community here. And so to ask questions not just about where to put a totem pole, but if there are opportunities for the actual practices and restorative justice around tribal presence in this region, I think is an important and worthwhile question. And I know I'm well over, but this is my last one. My final slide about the Foss Waterway, of voices that maybe aren't being heard or are not part of the story as much as they could be. This is an image of Thea Foss, who was a Norwegian immigrant who started Foss Maritime in 1889. She was the basis for the film Tugboat Annie, MGM 1933. So another question that I have for the collected folks sitting here today is, what would it mean to be a city where women can thrive as leaders, as in fact we are, right? If you look at some of the statistics that have been put forth by folks like, well, never mind, I don't have time for that, I'm not going to go into it. Let me just say, more than half of the college degrees awarded in this country right now are going to women. 56% of the student population at UW-T are female. And so if you are raising a child and a child happens to be female, think for a moment about the resources that go into your daughter's education, the time, the energy, the money. Do you really want children these young women to move into a world where the progress of women in the workplace has been stagnant for 10 years. And so what would it mean to be a city where we actively sought to create a different reality and support a different reality? I've well run out of time, so I'll just finish by saying I'm not suggesting that we include other voices. I think a real danger around selectively enlisting other voices and historically marginalized voices runs a real danger of instrumentalizing those folks, whether they're tribal members, whether they're women, whether they're children. And so I warn very carefully against that and emphasize the need to be inclusive, which is not the same thing as being participatory. Being inclusive is really framing the conditions under which deliberative democracy can take hold, and we can work out together a more robust and authentic vision for who we want to be as a city.